Jasmine's pulse hammered in her ears as the flight attendant's voice sliced through the cabin air, sharp and unyielding. "You're holding up the flight. Either sit somewhere else or get off." The word struck like a slap, cold, deliberate, and meant to sting. The low hum of murmured conversations died instantly, replaced by an eerie silence. Heads turned. Curious eyes flicked between Jasmine and the woman in uniform. Some were merely intrigued, others visibly irritated. A few passengers sighed heavily, exasperated, as if she were the one causing a scene. Jasmine inhaled slowly, controlled. Her fingers curled tighter around her boarding pass as she squared her shoulders, refusing to be intimidated. "I paid for this seat," she said, her voice steady despite the tension coiling in her chest. "I'm not moving." A murmur rippled through the plane, like the first distant rumble of a coming storm. A teenage boy in row 12 tilted his phone, the camera capturing every detail. In row 18, a black mother sat with her arms folded, unreadable, observing. And from the front of the cabin, a voice rang out, calm, composed, but carrying the weight of authority. "This young lady has every right to sit in the seat she was assigned." The tension cracked like a thunderclap. Silence gripped the cabin as a middle-aged man stepped into view, his navy suit crisp, an airline ID badge glinting under the overhead lights. The regional manager. Susan's face paled, her bravado evaporating in an instant. "Sir, Enough." The single word cut through the cabin with a finality that left no room for argument. His gaze swept across the scene, then settled on Jasmine with a nod of assurance. "Miss, please take your seat. You're exactly where you're supposed to be." Jasmine exhaled, the tightness in her chest loosening just slightly. But the regional manager wasn't done. His eyes locked onto Susan now, and his expression hardened. "As for you," he said, his voice edged with steel, "we'll discuss your employment status once we land." The reaction was instant. A hushed ripple of disbelief moved through the passengers. The businessman who had sighed dramatically earlier was suddenly staring at his hands, avoiding eye contact. The teenage boy's phone stayed fixed on the scene, capturing Susan's frozen expression, silent, stunned, as the weight of her actions came crashing down. Jasmine settled into her seat at last, the black mother in row 18 meeting her gaze. A single slow nod. Silent approval. Justice had been served. But this was only the beginning of the story. The airport had been a hive of movement, a chaotic symphony of rolling suitcases, overlapping announcements, and hurried conversations. The air smelled of brewed coffee and processed airport food. Travelers moved in different rhythms, some rushing, some waiting, all caught in the flow of transit. Jasmine Carter, 16 years old, stood near her gate, clutching her boarding pass with slightly sweaty fingers. This was her first time flying alone, and excitement churned uneasily in her stomach. Her parents had hugged her tightly before dropping her off, her mother giving her one last squeeze, her father ruffling her curls. "Text as soon as you land," her mother had said. "I will," Jasmine had promised. Now, she adjusted the strap of her backpack, the reality of her independence settling over her like a weighted blanket. She was on her own. The destination, Atlanta. The reason, her grandmother. It had been nearly 3 years since she'd last visited, life pulling her family in too many directions. School, work, finances, always something. But Nana had insisted. "You're growing up too fast, baby," she'd said over the phone, her voice rich with warmth. "Come let your Nana see you before you get too grown to visit." Jasmine had laughed, promised she would. And now, here she was, standing at gate C-14, waiting for her boarding group to be called. She was surrounded by strangers, all heading to the same city, but living completely different stories. When the boarding process began, she took a deep breath and stepped forward, handing her pass to the gate attendant. The woman barely glanced up, scanned the ticket, and waved her through. Jasmine walked down the jet bridge, her heart picking up speed. This was happening. Inside the plane, the air was cool, tinged with the sterile scent of industrial cleaner and recirculated oxygen. Flight attendants stood near the entrance, their smiles practiced and distant. Jasmine gave a polite nod, adjusting the strap on her backpack before stepping further into the aisle, scanning for her seat. 14B. A window seat. She had picked it intentionally, wanting to watch the world shrink below her. But as she reached row 14, her steps faltered. A man sat in her seat. Middle-aged, wrinkled button-up, worn-out sneakers. He flipped through a magazine like he owned the place, utterly at ease. Jasmine frowned, glancing down at her ticket again. 14B, definitely mine. "Excuse me," she said, keeping her voice polite but firm. "I think you're in my seat." The man barely glanced up. He flicked his eyes toward the seat, shrugged, and muttered, "Not my problem." Then he turned a page, dismissing her entirely. He crawled up Jasmine's neck. She wasn't the type to cause a scene, but she had paid for that seat. This wasn't some free-for-all. She took a slow breath and pressed the call button above her head. A simple mix-up. The flight attendant would check the tickets, sort it out. No big deal. She had no idea she had just set off a chain reaction that would change everything. The flight attendant who arrived moved with the brisk efficiency of someone who had seen it all before. But there was something else in her demeanor, something clipped and sharp, like she was already annoyed before Jasmine even spoke. The woman's name tag read Susan. She sighed dramatically, placing a hand on her hip. "What now?" Jasmine swallowed the irritation bubbling inside her. "I think there's been a mistake. This is my seat, but someone else is sitting in it. My ticket says 14B. She held up her boarding pass, expecting Susan to check the manifest, confirm the mistake, and resolve the issue. But Susan didn't even glance at the ticket. She barely looked at Jasmine before rolling her eyes. "Maybe you should have checked your seat before boarding," she said, her voice thick with condescension. Jasmine blinked, momentarily thrown. What? That didn't even make sense. Checking her seat before boarding? She had checked, on her ticket, multiple times. That's why she was standing here. "I did," Jasmine said, keeping her voice level. "I was assigned 14B. That's what my ticket says." Susan exhaled sharply, unimpressed. "Then maybe you're mistaken." She turned to the man in the seat. "Sir, is this your seat?" The man barely looked up. "Been sitting here since I got on," he muttered. Susan turned back to Jasmine with a smug smile, arms crossed. "See? He's been here. Maybe your seat is further back." Jasmine's pulse quickened. This wasn't right. Susan wasn't even checking. She was brushing Jasmine off like she didn't matter. The energy in the cabin shifted, passengers looking up, sensing something was off. Jasmine steadied herself. "I know where my seat is," she said. "I just need you to check." Susan scoffed. "Sweetheart, we're about to take off. I don't have time for this." Passengers who can't keep track of their seats. The words rang in Jasmine's ears, and she suddenly knew this wasn't just about a seat. It was about her. Jasmine's pulse pounded against her eardrums as the pilot's presence sent a ripple of tension through the cabin. His uniform was pristine, his shoulders squared with the kind of quiet authority that made people sit up straighter. The murmurs died instantly. Every set of eyes flicked between Jasmine and Susan, waiting to see how this was going to play out. Susan stepped forward, her smugness morphing into something more measured now that a superior was here. "Captain Reynolds," she said smoothly, adjusting her posture like she was the victim in all of this. "This passenger is refusing to comply with crew instructions. She's holding up our departure." Jasmine felt the heat of every stare drilling into her, the weight of assumption settling on her like a stone. The phrase refused to comply was a trigger, a coded way of making her sound like a problem, a threat. She could already see it, the way this story would be twisted if she didn't choose her words carefully. "I have a ticket for 14A, she said, forcing her voice to stay steady even as her hands trembled at her sides. "This is my seat. But there's someone sitting in it, and instead of checking the manifest, your crew member is trying to make me move somewhere else." The pilot's gaze flicked from her to Susan, then to the man still lounging in 14B, flipping through his magazine as if he were above all of this. He hadn't said a word, not to confirm or deny anything. That alone spoke volumes. "Captain, we don't have time for this," Susan pressed, voice sharper now. "I suggest we remove her so we can get going." Jasmine's stomach clenched. Remove her. Like she was an obstacle. Like she was disposable. The air in the cabin felt thick. Passengers shifted in their seats, waiting for the moment things would explode. The teenage boy recording hadn't lowered his phone. The mother in row 18 tightened her grip on her armrests, her lips pressed into a grim line. The older woman near the front still watched, her expression unreadable. The pilot exhaled through his nose, clearly irritated. "Let me see the passenger manifest." Susan hesitated. Just for a second. But it was enough. Jasmine caught the flicker of panic in her eyes. And just like that, she knew. Susan had never checked. She had doubled down, hoping Jasmine would just shrink away and disappear. That realization sent a fresh wave of anger through her, hot and undeniable. "Now, Susan!" the pilot ordered, his tone sharp enough to make her jump. Reluctantly, Susan pulled out the tablet strapped to her forearm, tapping through screens with jerky movements. The tension was unbearable, thick and suffocating. Jasmine refused to look away, refused to let her get away with this without accountability. Seconds stretched like hours. Then, finally, Susan's jaw clenched. Her nostrils flared as her eyes flicked up to meet Jasmine's. Jasmine already knew. "Seat 14A, the pilot said, his voice neutral, "is assigned to Miss." He glanced at the screen. "Jasmine Carter." Silence. A heavy, suffocating silence that filled every inch of the cabin. Jasmine swallowed past the lump in her throat, forcing herself to stand even taller. The passengers who had muttered for her to sit down were suddenly very quiet. The businessman across the aisle shifted uncomfortably, glancing away as if he hadn't been rolling his eyes at her 2 minutes ago. Even the teenage boy recording lowered his phone slightly, as if he realized this wasn't going to end in the viral outburst he'd been hoping for. Susan's mouth opened, then shut. Then opened again. "Well then," she said finally, her voice tight, "there must have been a mistake in the system." "No," Jasmine said, unable to stop herself. "The only mistake was you assuming I wouldn't push back." A gasp rippled through the cabin. Even the pilot's brow lifted slightly. Susan's entire face darkened, her fingers tightening around the tablet like she wanted to snap it in half. But she couldn't do anything now. Not with everyone watching. The pilot cleared his throat. "Sir," he said, turning to the man in 14B, "this seat is assigned to Miss Carter. I'm going to have to ask you to move." The man sighed dramatically, finally lowering his magazine. "Unbelievable," he muttered under his breath. But he stood, slow and drawn out like he was doing everyone a favor. Jasmine clenched her jaw as he slid into a different row, the same row Susan had tried to shove her into. He should have been the one questioned from the beginning, but instead, she had been the one put on trial. "You may take your seat, Miss Carter," the pilot said, his voice unreadable. Jasmine sat, her hands still shaking as she buckled her seatbelt. The moment she did, the energy in the plane shifted. Passengers turned away, suddenly finding their books or screens more interesting. Conversations picked up again, some forced, some casual, as if everyone was pretending they hadn't just been part of a spectacle. Susan stormed toward the front of the plane, her face stiff with barely concealed rage. The teenage boy hesitated, then slowly put his phone down. The mother in row 18 let out a quiet hum, something between approval and exhaustion. The older woman near the front gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod before turning back toward her window. Jasmine exhaled. Her hands still trembled. Her heart still raced. But she had one. And Susan knew it. The weight of those two words, "You're done," hung in the air like a thunderclap, rippling through the cabin. Susan's breath hitched, her eyes darting wildly between Robert and the pilot, searching for an escape, some kind of lifeline. None came. The pilot, stone-faced just moments ago, suddenly found an intense interest in the floor. The passengers, once silent onlookers, were now shifting in their seats, exchanging glances, their whispered murmurs carrying an unspoken verdict. Jasmine could feel it, the shift, the unraveling of Susan's power, the way her once smug confidence crumbled into something raw and desperate. But Jasmine didn't dare relax. Not yet. The moment was too fragile, teetering on the edge of justice, and yet still precariously close to slipping into another cruel reality. She forced herself to stay steady, gripping her ticket so tightly that the edges dug into her palm. Robert took a measured step forward, his expression unreadable. "Susan," he said, voice cool but firm, "you knowingly ignored protocol. You failed to verify a paying passenger's claim before escalating the situation. You," he let the weight of the moment press down on her, "chose to humiliate her rather than do your job." Susan flinched as if struck, her face paling. She started, but Robert didn't let her finish. "Enough." The finality in his tone sent a shudder through the cabin. "You've compromised the integrity of this airline, and worse, you've put us at risk of a lawsuit and a PR disaster." He let that sink in, the unspoken implication heavy in the air. This wasn't just about Susan's bias. This was about the airline protecting itself. Jasmine clenched her jaw, nausea twisting in her stomach. It was never just about what was right. It was about optics, about liability. But even so, she wasn't about to let Susan slither away without being held accountable. "And what happens now?" Jasmine asked, forcing her voice to stay level even though her heart was still pounding in her ears. Robert's gaze flicked to her, his features softening just slightly. "You stay in your assigned seat, Miss Carter, as you should have from the beginning. And Susan," he turned back to the disgraced flight attendant, his expression unreadable, "step off the plane. Now!" Susan's eyes widened. "Wait, what? No, I didn't." She whipped toward the pilot, her voice rising in pitch. "Captain, I was just—" The pilot didn't move, didn't speak. He just stood there, arms crossed, his silence damning. Susan's breath came faster, panicked. Her gaze darted to the passengers, but the looks she received weren't sympathetic. The elderly woman in the cardigan was watching her with something like satisfaction, her arms crossed neatly over her chest. The businessman, who had so easily dismissed Jasmine before, had gone rigid, his jaw clenched as if he regretted not stepping in sooner. The black mother in row 18 exhaled deeply, shaking her head, her expression a mixture of exhaustion and relief. And then there was the teenage boy with the phone, camera still rolling, capturing every second of Susan's downfall. Susan swallowed hard, her hands trembling at her sides. "Please," she tried one last time, voice cracking. "I didn't mean—" "Off the plane," Robert said, each word clipped and ice-cold. "Now!" The silence stretched impossibly long. And then, slowly, Susan's shoulders slumped. Defeated, humiliated. She turned stiffly, face burning with shame, and started toward the front of the plane. The walk of shame. A slow murmur moved through the passengers. A shift in energy. It wasn't applause, but it was close. Satisfaction, quiet approval, the weight of a collective breath finally being released. Jasmine let out a slow, measured breath, but she wasn't celebrating. She was still reeling, still bracing for something to go wrong. But then, Robert turned back to her, and for the first time since this nightmare began, she saw something she hadn't expected in his face: acknowledgement. "I'm sorry this happened, Miss Carter," he said, his voice steady. "It never should have." She swallowed hard. She wanted to say something, wanted to believe this was more than just damage control. But she had learned long ago that apologies were just words unless followed by action. So she nodded once, keeping her expression neutral. Robert gave her one final nod before turning sharply on his heel, disappearing toward the cockpit. The passengers slowly settled, murmurs fading. The pilot cleared his throat, shifting awkwardly. "We'll be taking off shortly," he said, then hurried after Robert. Jasmine let out a shaky exhale and finally, sank into her seat. The teenage boy put his phone down, shaking his head. "That was insane," he muttered, mostly to himself. The elderly woman leaned slightly toward Jasmine, her voice low but firm. "Don't let them forget this," she said. "People like her count on silence." Jasmine met her gaze. And this time, she let herself believe, for just a second, that she wasn't alone. Susan's face drained of color, her breath hitching in short, uneven bursts. She turned desperately to the pilot, her eyes wide with silent pleading, but he didn't move, didn't speak. No one did. The walls of authority she had hidden behind had crumbled, leaving her exposed, defenseless. Robert took a slow, deliberate step forward, lowering his voice just enough for only her to hear. "You don't get to treat passengers like this. Not on my airline." Susan swallowed hard, her throat working as if she were trying to force down her own panic. For the first time since this ordeal began, she looked afraid. The silence in the cabin stretched unbearably, thick with tension, with judgment, with the weight of everything she had done crashing down upon her. And then, in one final, humiliating moment, Susan's shoulders slumped. She turned, grabbed her bag with shaking hands, and walked off the plane. Her movements were stiff, mechanical, like a marionette with its strings cut. As she stepped into the aisle, her gaze darted around the cabin, searching for someone, anyone, who would come to her defense. The businessman who had once sighed so dramatically at Jasmine now sat rigid, his eyes glued to the seat back in front of him, pretending he wasn't there. The teenage boy with the phone hadn't lowered his camera for a second, capturing every tremor in Susan's hands, every flicker of humiliation in her expression. The black mother in row 18 sat still, her arms crossed, her face unreadable. But the tiniest of nods passed between her and Jasmine, small, almost imperceptible, but heavy with meaning. Susan let out a nervous, breathy laugh, brittle and desperate. "You can't be serious," she scoffed, her voice climbing higher, cracking under the weight of disbelief. "I was just doing my job." Robert didn't flinch. His voice remained firm, unwavering. "No, Susan. Your job was to assist passengers, not humiliate them. Your job was to de-escalate, not turn this into a personal vendetta. Instead, you ignored protocol, dismissed common decency, and now you're facing the consequences." Passengers murmured, the shift in the air undeniable. Susan's face flushed a deep, splotchy red, whether from anger, shame, or both. Her last chance at salvation stood before her, the pilot. She turned sharply. "Captain, say something! You saw what happened." The pilot hesitated, his lips pressing into a hard line. He had been willing to let this escalate, willing to let Jasmine be removed without so much as checking the manifest. But now, with the airline's regional manager here, with cameras rolling, with the weight of public scrutiny hanging thick in the air, he wasn't willing to risk his job for Susan's mistake. His jaw tightened. "I think it's best you listen to Robert." Susan's mouth opened, but no words came. Her last lifeline had snapped. The passengers weren't on her side. The crew wasn't on her side. She was alone. She reached for her bag, her fingers trembling as she yanked it from the overhead compartment. A silence so deep it seemed to press against the skin settled over the cabin. She turned to leave, her steps forced, her spine stiff, her chin lifted in a final attempt at dignity. But then, a single clap, then another, and another. A slow, deliberate ripple of applause spread through the cabin. It wasn't a victory cheer. It wasn't loud or raucous. It was a quiet, pointed acknowledgement. The weight of the moment was undeniable. Susan's body went rigid, her back straightening as if struck. She didn't turn around. She didn't need to. She could feel their eyes on her, feel the judgment settling over her like a thick fog. Jasmine didn't clap. She just watched, her pulse still hammering, her breath shallow. She had won. Justice had been served. And yet, the victory felt heavy, exhausting, bittersweet. Susan took a hesitant step forward, but then, as if remembering herself, she lifted her chin slightly and continued down the aisle. The businessman across from Jasmine sat utterly still, his fingers gripping his armrest, as if he could make himself invisible. His earlier dismissal of her was burned into his own memory now, impossible to ignore. As Susan neared the exit, the elderly woman near the front, the same woman who had spoken up for Jasmine, tilted her head slightly and gave a small, deliberate shake. Not smug, not cruel, just disappointment. A wordless statement that carried more weight than any reprimand could. Susan hesitated. For the briefest of seconds, her mask cracked. Then, with nothing left to say, she stepped through the open door and disappeared. Robert turned back to the passengers, his expression calm, composed. "We appreciate your patience," he said, his voice carrying across the cabin. "We will be continuing our flight shortly." And just like that, it was over. The applause faded. Passengers adjusted in their seats, some pretending they hadn't been watching, others sneaking one last glance at Jasmine before shifting their gaze elsewhere. The teenage boy with the phone lowered his device, grinning slightly in her direction before tucking it away. Jasmine let out a slow breath and sank into her seat, the one she had fought for. She had one. So why did it still feel so damn heavy? Jasmine sat motionless, the exhaustion settling into her bones. The air in the plane was different now, charged with unspoken energy. Some passengers whispered, their eyes flicking toward her when they thought she wasn't looking. Others avoided her gaze entirely, desperate to pretend this had never happened. Then, a warm hand wrapped around hers. Jasmine startled slightly, turning to find the black mother from row 18 standing beside her. Her eyes held something deeper than gratitude. Recognition. Understanding. A silent acknowledgement of what had just transpired. "You have no idea how much I needed to see that today," the woman whispered, giving Jasmine's hand a firm squeeze before pulling away. Jasmine swallowed hard, her throat tight. She wanted to speak, to say something, but the words tangled in her chest. She could only nod. The woman gave her one last knowing look before returning to her seat. From the front, the elderly woman met Jasmine's gaze and gave a small, approving nod. Not just kindness, not just support, but something deeper. "I see you." Jasmine exhaled, the storm still raging inside her. Across the aisle, the businessman hunched over his in-flight magazine, turning the pages without reading a single word. He hadn't spoken since Susan had been fired. He never would. He would pretend he had been neutral all along, that he had never doubted her, never dismissed her. But Jasmine knew better. And somehow, she knew that deep down, so did he. The rest of the flight blurred into the background. The hum of the engines. The occasional crackle of the intercom. The quiet murmurs of conversations returning to normal. Jasmine stared out the window, watching as the sky shifted from deep blue to streaks of orange and pink. The world kept moving. But she would never forget. Jasmine sat rigid in her seat, her fingers tapping against the armrest in a rapid, erratic rhythm. Her thoughts were a tangled mess, emotions still raw from what had just unfolded. The reality of it hadn't fully sunk in, and yet, something inside her whispered that nothing about her life would be the same after this. She barely registered the passage of time, her body going through the motions in autopilot, until the pilot's voice crackled over the speakers, announcing their descent into Atlanta. The plane jolted slightly as the landing gear extended, the shift in altitude making her ears pop. She swallowed hard, reaching for her phone out of habit. The screen lit up as she unlocked it, and in an instant, the world she thought she knew shifted again. Her notifications were exploding, messages, missed calls, social media mentions piling in faster than she could comprehend. Her stomach clenched, a cold wave of anxiety washing over her. With a hesitant breath, she clicked on one of the alerts, and immediately, a video filled her screen. A video of her. Jasmine's breath hitched. She tapped it, and suddenly, she was watching herself through someone else's phone. The footage was grainy, but there was no mistaking the scene. There was Susan, standing over her, sneering, exuding authority she no longer held. There was Jasmine, calm yet unyielding, her voice steady despite the weight of the moment. And then Susan's words echoed back at her through the recording, sharp and cutting. "You think you can just argue your way into first class?" Underneath the video, bold white text stood out against the dark background. Flight attendant tries to humiliate a black teen over a seat, gets fired instead. Jasmine's fingers trembled as she scrolled. The video had been uploaded less than an hour ago, and it was already everywhere. Shares, retweets, and comments flooded her screen, a wave of reactions she couldn't even begin to process. Her heart pounded as she skimmed through news headlines. Teen stands her ground against discriminatory flight attendant. Airline fires employee mid-flight. Another day, another viral travel nightmare. This wasn't just a moment anymore. It was a story. A national conversation. And she was at the center of it. Her thumb hovered over the screen as she scrolled through the flood of comments. Outrage. Praise. Debate. Some were furious on her behalf, demanding accountability, calling for airlines to do better. Others dissected every second of the video, arguing over intent. Was Susan's behavior explicitly racist? Or was she just a bad flight attendant having a bad day? Jasmine frowned. A bad day? Was this really just one bad day? Or had Susan done this before? Had other passengers complained? Had she been warned? Or had she been allowed to act this way for years, unchecked, unquestioned, until today? Or worse, had she just ruined someone's career over a single mistake? The thought twisted in her stomach, a brief pang of doubt cutting through the adrenaline still surging in her veins. But then she remembered. Susan made her choices. She chose to dismiss Jasmine without even checking the manifest. She chose to humiliate her in front of an entire plane. She chose to escalate instead of de-escalate. She chose to treat Jasmine like a problem, instead of a paying customer. This wasn't just one bad moment. This was about power. Susan had believed she had the authority to treat Jasmine however she wanted. She had expected to get away with it. But she hadn't. Jasmine exhaled, her grip tightening around her phone. This wasn't about a seat. This was about justice. The city lights of Atlanta sparkled below as the plane descended, but Jasmine wasn't looking outside anymore. The weight of the experience pressed down on her chest, heavy but clarifying. Susan wasn't a victim. She was just someone who had finally faced the consequences of her own actions. The plane touched down with a soft thud, the wheels skimming the runway. Around her, passengers shifted in their seats, stretching, reaching for bags, adjusting their coats, ready to move on, as if none of this had happened. But Jasmine knew better. This moment, her moment, wasn't over. She glanced at her phone one last time. The notifications kept rolling in, a never-ending stream of conversations, of people sharing their own stories of being dismissed, ignored, belittled. Others asked the same question now burning in her mind. How many times had this happened before the cameras were rolling? And now, she wanted to ask you. Have you ever experienced discrimination like this? Have you ever been made to feel like you didn't belong, even when you knew you did? What would you have done in Jasmine's place? Would you have stayed quiet, let it go, avoided conflict? Or would you have stood your ground, even knowing the risk? Because this wasn't just about a seat on a plane, this was about how people are treated, and who gets believed. Jasmine hadn't shouted. She hadn't caused a scene. She hadn't done anything wrong. And yet, Susan had spoken to her like she was an inconvenience, something to be removed. The pilot had taken Susan's side without question. The businessman had dismissed her before hearing the full story. And that's how it happens. Discrimination doesn't always come as slurs or outright aggression. Sometimes it's a sigh, a look, a refusal to even consider that you might be right. It's the moment you're told you're overreacting, when you know damn well you're not. And sometimes, it's someone like Susan realizing, too late, that her power wasn't absolute. Jasmine hadn't just stood up for herself. She had stood up for everyone who had ever been told to sit down and take it. And this time, the world had seen it. The line of passengers started to move, filing into the aisle as the plane doors opened. Jasmine remained in her seat for a moment longer, inhaling deeply. When she finally stood, grabbing her bag, she felt it in her bones. She wasn't just another passenger anymore. She had boarded this flight as an excited teenager on her way to visit her grandmother. Now, she was walking off as a symbol. Because racism doesn't always come as screaming or violence. Sometimes it's a tone, a dismissal, a refusal to even check the facts, because someone has already decided you don't matter. It's in the way people expect you to give up, to shrink, to let it go. And it's in the way, the second you don't, you become the problem. But refusing to be dismissed, speaking your truth, even when your voice shakes, that's how real change happens. Jasmine knew this wouldn't be the last time something like this happened. Not to her. Not to others. But she also knew one thing for certain. Every time someone stood up, it became harder for the world to ignore. And now, the story was out. The video was spreading. The conversation was happening. So what happens next? That's up to you. Hit like, share, comment, because the more we talk about it, the more we can change.